There is a type of person who will absorb your worst behavior, forgive things most people would never tolerate, and love you through pain that would make others disappear immediately. And the terrifying part is, you won't realize what you had until you feel the silence where they used to be. Most people think the dangerous ones are the loud ones, the ones who argue back, the ones who threaten, manipulate, create drama. But psychology tells us something different. The most powerful people in any relationship are rarely the loudest. They're the ones paying the closest attention. And when you have spent years being deeply aware of everyone around you, absorbing emotional patterns most people never notice, reading between every line of every conversation, you develop a kind of psychological depth that most people will never understand. And that depth, once it turns inward, becomes something nobody saw coming. This is about what happens inside the mind of someone who feels everything deeply. What happens when they finally stop giving that feeling to someone who never deserved it? And why the people who dismiss that kind of emotional intelligence almost always end up regretting it at a level they were completely unprepared for. Pay attention here, because most people only learn this lesson after it is already too late to use. The first thing you need to understand is that highly emotionally sensitive people are not emotional simply because they feel more. They are emotional because they process more. There is a significant difference. Feeling and processing are not the same operation. Most people experience emotion and react. Highly sensitive people experience emotion, analyze it, trace it back to its source, compare it to previous patterns, assign meaning to it, and then decide how to respond. That entire sequence can happen in seconds, and it happens almost involuntarily. What this means in practice is that while you are speaking, they are absorbing tone, word choice, eye contact, timing, what you skipped over, what you repeated, what you said softly versus what you said with force. They are not just hearing your words, they are building a psychological profile of your emotional state in real time. Most people have no idea this is happening. And most people who would feel uncomfortable knowing this is happening are usually the ones whose words and behavior do not match. That disconnect, words saying one thing while behavior says something completely different, is something deeply perceptive people detect almost immediately. They may not confront it right away. They are usually patient. They usually give the benefit of the doubt. They look for alternate explanations before assuming the worst about someone. But they store every inconsistency, every contradiction, every moment where the story shifted slightly. And over time, those stored observations form a picture. A complete, detailed, undeniable picture. Not built from assumption, built from evidence they collected quietly while you assumed they believed everything you told them. This is why emotional intelligence at its highest level is not softness. It is precision. It is sustained, involuntary, deeply accurate observation of human behavior. And the people who dismiss this kind of awareness as oversensitivity usually do so because accurate observation is a threat to anyone whose behavior does not hold up under scrutiny. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear. Deeply perceptive people tend to stay far longer than they should in painful situations. Not because they are weak, not because they lack options, but because they are wired to search for meaning in behavior. When most people encounter a painful pattern in someone they love, they ask, "What does this mean about us?" Emotionally sensitive people ask a different question. They ask, "What is this behavior telling me about their pain?" That shifting question changes everything. Because suddenly, the harmful behavior is no longer a reason to leave. It becomes a puzzle to solve, a wound to heal, a broken part of someone they believe in, even when that person has stopped believing in themselves. This is both the most beautiful and most dangerous quality these people carry, because you cannot pour meaning into something indefinitely without eventually confronting the truth of what it actually is. Think about someone you know, maybe yourself, who stayed in something painful far longer than made logical sense. Not because they were stupid, not because they lacked self-worth, but because they were trying to find the version of that person they believed existed underneath the damage. They were refusing to give up on the potential they saw, even while the reality kept contradicting it. That experience, that specific kind of emotional exhaustion, is something deeply perceptive people know intimately. They have usually lived through multiple versions of it before they learn what they are about to learn. There comes a moment, and it is rarely loud, rarely dramatic, often completely invisible to the outside world, where something inside them shifts. Not breaks, shifts. The psychology behind this is more important than most people realize. Human beings are remarkably capable of enduring pain. What we are far less capable of enduring is meaninglessness. Pain with a purpose, pain attached to growth, pain that is part of a story moving somewhere, is survivable almost indefinitely. But pain that loops, pain that repeats, pain that exists not because something is being built, but because someone has decided your patience is simply available to them. That kind of pain eventually crosses a threshold no amount of love can extend past. And when deeply aware people cross that threshold, the response is not rage. It is not revenge. It is not even sadness in the traditional sense. It is clarity. And clarity in a person who already understands human behavior at a precise level is the most consequential thing that can happen to a relationship. Because the moment they stop interpreting your behavior through hope and start seeing it through pattern recognition, the entire emotional architecture changes. They are no longer asking what your behavior means. They already know what your behavior means. They have known for a while. What changed is they stopped pretending they did not know. Most people experience that shift and get angry. They explode. They call. They send the long message. They demand explanation. But emotionally intelligent people often go quiet because they have already had the internal conversation. They have already processed the grief, the disappointment, the slow recognition of what was actually happening beneath the surface of every moment they misread as love. By the time they go quiet externally, they are already on the other side of the grief internally. And that internal processing is why people on the outside almost always say the same thing when these relationships end. They say, "I never saw it coming. Everything seemed fine. They seemed okay. They never even told me they were upset." And that is precisely the part nobody understands. They did tell you. Not in a single dramatic moment. They told you in the slight change in how they responded. They told you when they stopped initiating. They told you when their answers got shorter. They told you when they stopped sharing the small things, the observations, the random thoughts they used to send you without thinking. They told you in 100 small, quiet ways that added up to a complete sentence. You just didn't have the emotional vocabulary to read it. And here is the part that catches most people completely off guard. While you were misreading the silence as contentment, they were preparing. Not preparing revenge, not planning something cruel. They were quietly, steadily, almost imperceptibly withdrawing the emotional energy they had been pouring into the relationship. Every deeply perceptive person has a finite amount of emotional investment. It is not unlimited. It only seems unlimited because it flows so naturally and so generously for so long that people begin to mistake it for a permanent feature of the environment, like air conditioning or gravity. Something that will simply always be there regardless of what you do. But it is not. It is a choice, made every single day, renewed by respect, by honesty, by the basic evidence that what is being given is being valued. And when that evidence disappears long enough, the choice quietly stops being renewed. This is the psychological mechanism that makes the ending of these relationships so disorienting for the people left behind. They are not losing someone who just decided to leave. They are losing someone who had already emotionally left months ago. The physical departure is just the formality. The actual departure happened in dozens of quiet moments the other person never noticed, never addressed, never even registered as significant. By the time the relationship formally ends, the deeply aware person has already grieved, already processed, already rebuilt something internal that does not require the relationship to survive anymore, which is why they seem fine, which is why their peace looks like coldness to people expecting them to fall apart. They are not cold. They are already free. And freedom, to someone who expected them to need the relationship, looks absolutely bewildering. Now let's talk about what actually happens to the person who caused the damage, because this is the part people underestimate most dramatically. For a while, usually a short while, there is relief, especially for people who were emotionally immature in the relationship. People who use the deeply aware person's patience as a resource. People who made emotional mistakes and then leaned on the other person's capacity for understanding to avoid real consequences. When the relationship ends, the first feeling is often something close to relief. The accountability is gone. The awareness is gone. The person who always noticed too much, who always understood too well, who always saw past the surface story, is gone. That awareness, while comforting in many ways, can feel suffocating to someone who is not prepared to be fully known. So there is relief, for a moment. And then something starts happening that almost nobody talks about openly. The patterns do not disappear just because the person who reflected them back does. See, deeply perceptive people do not just provide emotional support. They provide a kind of psychological mirror. In their presence, people are seen. Their contradictions are gently exposed. Their wounds are acknowledged. Their patterns are reflected back to them through the quality of attention they receive. Most people do not realize how much that mirror was doing until it is gone. And when it disappears, two things happen simultaneously. First, the behavior patterns that the perceptive person was quietly absorbing and softening now have nothing to cushion them. The emotional immaturity, the inconsistency, the avoidance, all of it runs unchecked into new relationships, new friendships, new environments, and people start noticing. Not with the patience and understanding the previous person offered, with immediate reaction, conflict, departure. The world without that steady, understanding presence suddenly feels much harsher, much less forgiving. Second, and this is the one that creates real, lasting impact, the perceptive person takes all that depth with them. They take the specific quality of attention they offered. They take the kind of listening most people have never experienced anywhere else. They take the emotional safety that made vulnerability feel possible. And here's the truth that hits people with a particular sharpness when they finally let themselves feel it fully. That depth cannot be replicated. Not because nobody else is capable of it in theory, but because what was built in that specific relationship, that specific accumulated knowledge of who you are underneath every version of yourself you show the world, does not exist anywhere else. It has to be rebuilt from scratch, and it takes years. And sometimes people search for it in person after person, relationship after relationship, and never find the same combination again. This is not about punishment. This is not the universe balancing some cosmic ledger. It is simply the natural consequence of failing to recognize the value of something rare while you still had daily access to it. People notice oxygen when they cannot breathe. They notice emotional depth when they are drowning in the shallow water of connections built on performance, convenience, or mutual distraction. And for some people, that recognition comes early enough to create real change. For others, it arrives years later in a quiet moment, sitting somewhere ordinary, remembering, feeling the specific shape of something they cannot name, but knowing exactly what its absence has cost them. And here is the final piece, the one that matters most for anyone in this room who identifies with that quality of depth. Because everything discussed so far has been about what happens to the people on the outside. Now it is time to talk about what this recognition should mean for you. If you are someone who feels deeply, if you are someone who absorbs the emotional environments around you without being asked, if you are someone who has stayed too long, given too much, explained yourself to people who were never genuinely curious about the explanation, if you have bent your nervous system into uncomfortable shapes trying to love someone who was never going to meet you at the level you were meeting them, then you need to hear this clearly. The capacity to feel deeply is not a flaw. It has never been a flaw. It is one of the rarest and most powerful forms of human intelligence that exists. But intelligence without application is just potential. And for a long time, many of you have been applying that intelligence entirely in the wrong direction. Outward. Toward people who were absorbing it without reciprocating it. Toward situations that were consuming it without deserving it. The transformation that changes everything is not becoming less sensitive. It is not building walls. It is not learning to feel less or care less or love less. That approach does not work, and it was never the answer. The transformation is learning to direct that same level of precision and awareness that you have always naturally applied to others inward, toward your own experience, toward your own needs, toward the honest recognition of what actually feels good versus what you have been convincing yourself is acceptable because changing it felt too difficult or too painful or too uncertain. When a deeply perceptive person stops pouring their awareness outward into people who do not value it and starts using that same awareness to understand themselves, everything changes. They start recognizing patterns in their own choices. They start noticing the early signals they used to override. They start honoring the internal discomfort they used to explain away with reasons about other people's pain or other people's potential or other people's circumstances. And they start understanding, maybe for the first time, that their nervous system was sending them accurate information all along. They were just too committed to someone else's comfort to let themselves listen to it. This is where the evolution begins. Not the performance of strength, not the rehearsed confidence that comes from pretending not to care. Real, quiet, earned, lived-in self-trust. The kind that comes from surviving the thing you were most afraid of and discovering, on the other side of it, that you are still intact, still whole, still capable of extraordinary depth. But now that depth has direction, it has intention, it has a boundary. Not a wall, a boundary. The difference matters because walls keep everything out. Boundaries let the right things in while keeping the harmful things at a safe distance. A person who has learned this, who has earned this through the specific kind of pain that comes from loving without being loved back at the same level. Who has rebuilt themselves not by becoming harder, but by becoming more honest with themselves about what they deserve and what they will no longer accept. That person becomes quietly extraordinary. Not in a way that makes noise. In a way that changes the quality of everything they touch. Their relationships become more intentional. Their investments of time and energy become more precise. Their peace becomes something they guard not out of fear, but out of genuine understanding of how rare it is and how much it costs to find. And the people around them feel it immediately. Not because they announce the change, but because the energy is different. The availability is different. The desperation is gone. And when desperation leaves, dignity fills the space. This is the trajectory. Not immediately, not painlessly, not without confusion and difficulty and moments of wondering whether staying in the easier, more familiar version of yourself was the better choice. But eventually, for anyone willing to do the internal work, this is the trajectory. You do not become someone who loves less. You become someone who finally loves themselves with the same consistency they always loved everyone else. And once that shift completes, you become the kind of person whose presence others will spend years trying to forget. Not because you became unreachable, but because you became real. Fully, honestly, completely real. With yourself first, and then with every person lucky enough to remain in your life after you learned to stop giving away what was only ever meant for the people who truly, genuinely deserved it. The lesson is not regret it. The lesson is recognition. Recognize depth when it is still in front of you, because by the time it becomes a memory, you are already living with the permanent version of having missed it.